There has a dead man in this room. His family has been outside for 3 days. The priests have been working for 3 days. And when the wrapping is finished and the prayers are done, they will seal this room, and the man inside it will begin the longest journey anyone has ever taken. But right now, a pair of hands is doing something strange. They are placing a face on top of a face. The mask is green. The beard points straight up. The eyes are painted black, and they look at something no one else in the room can see. The hands lower it slowly onto the dead man's face. And for a moment, 2 faces exist at the same time. The face of a man who was alive last week, and the face of a god who died before Egypt had a name. On the wall behind them, painted in red and gold, there is a scale, 2 plates hanging in perfect balance. On one plate, a human heart. On the other, a single feather. Nobody in the room looks at it. They have seen it too many times to see it anymore. But it is there. Here is the question this story is going to answer. Why did the Egyptians put the face of this particular god on the faces of their dead? What did he do? What did he survive? What did he become? They did not choose him because he was powerful. Every god was powerful. They chose him because he had already been where the dead man was going. He had already been broken apart and put back together and forced to become something he was never supposed to be. He was the only god in Egypt who knew what it felt like to lose everything. On the wall, the scale waits. The feather sits perfectly still. The story starts a long time before this room. It starts with a king who made the world feel safe, and a brother who was measuring him the whole time. Picture the Nile in the middle of summer. The Nile, before postcards and tourist boats. The Nile, when it was the only thing standing between millions of people and starvation. Brown water rising over the banks, spreading across the flat land on both sides, carrying black silt from the mountains far to the south and laying it down across the fields of the delta like a promise kept. The Egyptians called this season Akhet, the flood, and they did not fear it the way you might expect people to fear a river swallowing their fields. They waited for it. They planned around it. They built their houses back from the edge, knowing the water was coming. And when it came, they watched it the way you watch something you have been promised, because that is exactly what it was, a promise. When the flood came on time, it meant the world was working. When the black silt settled and the water pulled back and the seeds went into the ground, it meant that something larger than any human decision was keeping the agreement it had always kept. The farmers did not have a word for this feeling exactly, but they felt it every year when the water rose, a loosening in the chest, a breath let out. This is the world Osiris was born into, a world organized entirely around the belief that order was real and that something was responsible for maintaining it. The Egyptians had a word for that order, Mat. It gets translated as justice, or truth, or cosmic balance. And all of those translations are right, and none of them are quite right. In the Egyptian imagination, Mat was the condition that made everything else possible, the thing underneath the rules, the reason the sun came up on the same side every morning, and the river flooded at the same time every year, and the stars moved in the patterns they always moved in. Mat was not maintained by wishing. It required someone to stand in the middle of it and hold it in place, every single day, through ritual and judgment and the simple fact of his existence on the throne. The king of Egypt was performing a function that the entire civilization depended on. He was not just a political leader. He was the hinge, the point where divine order touched human life. If the hinge held, everything held. What the Egyptians feared most was not death. Every civilization fears death. What they feared specifically, in a way that shaped everything they built and painted and buried and prayed over, was disintegration, the erasure of the self, the possibility that after you died, There would be no you left. Your body would rot. Your name would be forgotten. The identity you had spent your whole life building would dissolve like salt in the Nile, and there would be nothing to show you had ever existed. That fear is why they built the pyramids. That fear is why they wrapped their dead in linen and placed their organs in jars and painted their names on every surface of their tombs. That fear is why this story exists at all. A man stands on the bank of the Nile before dawn. The water has not risen yet. The fields behind him are dry. He does not pray out loud. He just watches the river, waiting for it to do what it has always done. He does not know the name of the God who keeps that promise. He only knows that something does. And right now, with the season turning and the water still low, the waiting feels like the most dangerous thing in the world. This is the world Osiris was born to protect. A world that trusted order so completely, it never considered what would happen the day order was attacked from inside. Osiris was the son of Geb and Nut. Geb was the earth. Nut was the sky. And Osiris was born in the space between them, which is another way of saying he was born in the only place where life actually happens, the middle, the world where human beings plant their crops and raise their children and try to make sense of the time they have. He had 3 siblings, Isis, Set, and Nephthys, 4 children from the same divine parents. And from the beginning they fell into 2 pairs without anyone deciding that was how it would be. Osiris and Isis at the center, steady and bright. Set and Nephthys at the edge, defined by everything the center was not. It was not a punishment. It was not a hierarchy anyone designed. It was just the way they were. Osiris became king. And here is the thing about his reign that the stories almost always miss. It was not dramatic. There was no great war he won to take the throne. There was no monster he defeated. No trial he survived. He simply began ruling. And under his rule, the world worked the way the world was supposed to work. He taught the Egyptians to farm. He established laws. He organized the rituals that kept Mart in place. And then, because he believed that what worked for Egypt could work for the rest of the world, he left Egypt in the hands of Isis and traveled, not to conquer, to teach. He walked into foreign lands and showed people how to grow grain and live in organized communities and treat each other with enough consistency that life could be planned around the next season rather than just the next day. He came back. Egypt was exactly as he had left it. This happened over and over, and nothing dramatic occurred. That was the achievement. The absence of catastrophe, the ordinary mornings when the sun came up, and the priests performed their rituals, and the farmers went to their fields, and the children played along the riverbank, and not one person had reason to believe any of it was fragile. Osiris gave Egypt the greatest gift a king can give, and it is the gift that almost never gets credited, because you cannot point to it and say, look what he built. You can only feel it in the texture of daily life, in the way people made plans, in the way they trusted that tomorrow would resemble today. He had one weakness. It was not physical, not slow in thought, not careless in judgment. His weakness was in what he could not imagine. Osiris could not imagine that someone who had everything he had, who lived inside the same order he was maintaining, who sat at the same table and called him brother, would want to destroy it. He understood ambition. He understood jealousy. But he understood them as forces that operated outside the family, outside the circle of people bound by the same obligations he felt so deeply. He could not imagine betrayal from inside the room. In a workshop far from the palace, a craftsman is working carefully. He takes measurements the way skilled craftsmen always take measurements, with patience and precision, and the complete attention of someone who understands that the work will outlast the working. He does not know who commissioned the piece. He only knows the dimensions, length, width, the exact curve of shoulders, the specific distance from crown to heel. He builds something beautiful and does not ask what it is for. Set was not the villain. Not in every story. Not in every temple. Not in every version of the Egyptian world that survived long enough for us to read it. Set was the god of the desert, of storms, of the red land beyond the black soil, where the Nile stopped reaching and the sand began. He was chaos, but not the chaos of meaningless destruction. He was the chaos that kept the borders sharp, the force that said, here is where Egypt ends and the wilderness begins, the violence that protected the center by living permanently at the edge. And every single night, Set stood at the prow of the sun god Ra's boat and fought the same battle. The serpent Apophis lived in the darkness beneath the world. Every night, when Ra's boat carried the sun through the underworld to rise again in the morning, Apophis was waiting, a serpent so large its body filled the passage, a force so old it existed before the gods had names. Its only purpose was to swallow the sun and end everything. The light, the crops, the Nile flood, the children playing on the riverbank, everything. Set killed it every night. He drove his spear into the serpent's body and held the passage open while Ra's boat moved through. He did this alone, in complete darkness, while the rest of the gods slept or feasted or argued about things that only mattered because Set was doing his job in the dark. When the sun rose in the morning, nobody thanked him. Why would they? The sun rose every morning. That was what the sun did. Set stood on the prow of the boat in the darkness and killed the thing that wanted to end the world. And then he watched the morning begin for everyone else. Now, look at what he came home to. Osiris had the throne, the fields, the gratitude of every person in Egypt for the harvests that came and the laws that held and the ordinary mornings that felt like gifts. Osiris had Isis, the most powerful and brilliant presence in the divine world, who chose him and stood beside him and made everything he did sharper and more complete than it would have been alone. Osiris had a kingdom and a purpose and a name that people spoke with warmth. Set had the desert. He had the edge, the place where things stopped, the function that everyone depended on and nobody acknowledged, because acknowledging it would mean admitting how close the violence always was, how thin the line between the fertile black land and the dead red sand. His nature was what it was, and his nature did not have a place inside the world Osiris was building. Or rather, it had a place that the world could not afford to name, because if you named it, if you said out loud that order required chaos to define its edges, that the green fields only existed because something violent was holding the desert back, then you had to admit that Set was as necessary as Osiris. And you had to ask why necessary things got the desert while beautiful things got the throne. There is a guard at the city gate. He stands there every night through every season, in the cold and the heat and the rain that comes sideways off the Nile. Nobody knows his name. The merchants who pass through in the morning nod at him sometimes. The children run past without looking. When nothing bad happens, when no one breaks through, when the city wakes up safe and starts its day without incident, that is his success. But his success looks exactly like nothing. You can only see his failure. You can only see him when something gets through. He stands at the gate in the dark and thinks about the people sleeping behind him. He keeps them safe. He knows he keeps them safe. He wonders if that is enough. Set did not decide to become a destroyer in a single moment. He became what he became, the way water finds a crack in stone. Slowly, over years of standing at the edge of a world that needed him and could not say so, over nights of doing the most important work in the universe, while the universe celebrated someone else. And Set was patient. He had learned patience in the dark. He had learned that the most important things were not done quickly. He had learned to wait for exactly the right moment, the right occasion. The right room full of people who trusted the man throwing the party. He was very good at waiting. The sun rose every morning because Set was in the dark every night. And Set looked at that morning, every morning, and understood something that would have broken a smaller god a long time ago. He understood that the world he was saving did not know he was saving it. Set was complicated in the way that real things are complicated. What he did next cannot be excused, but it can be understood, and understanding it makes the story more honest than simply calling him evil and moving on. He began to plan. Before we get to the coffin, you need to understand what Isis was. Osiris was kingship. He was order made visible, authority, given a face and a body that walked through the world, doing the things that kept everything running. He was the form that power took when it was working correctly. Isis was everything that made that form possible. She was magic, but not magic in the way children's stories use the word. Magic in the Egyptian sense meant the knowledge of how things actually worked beneath the surface of what anyone could see. The ability to speak the hidden names of things and make them respond. The understanding that the world was not just what it appeared to be. That underneath every visible surface, there was a deeper structure. And that if you knew that structure well enough, you could work with it in ways that looked impossible from the outside. Osiris could hold the world in place by being present in it. Isis could reshape the world by understanding it. One without the other was incomplete. A king with power but no wisdom is just force wearing a crown. Wisdom without power is just knowledge that cannot act. Together, they were something the Egyptian world had a word for, and we do not. Something like the completeness that happens when two things that were always meant to fit together finally do. Isis knew things that Osiris did not know. She watched, Set in rooms. She noticed what he looked at when he thought no one was watching. She saw the particular quality of silence that fell over him when Osiris received praise. The way his expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. Something small and controlled, and very old. She saw the way he watched the throne, with the specific attention of someone who has been told their whole life that a certain thing is not for them, and has spent that whole life quietly deciding whether that is actually true. She tried to tell Osiris, not with accusations and evidence, but in the way that people warn the people they love when they cannot quite prove what they know. A comment here, a question there, a suggestion that maybe Set's invitation to this particular feast should be declined. Osiris listened, the way good people listen to warnings they cannot quite believe, with patience, with the genuine desire to take it seriously, and with the inability to act on it, because acting on it would mean believing that his brother, his blood, the person who had been in every room with him for as long as either of them had existed, was planning something that Osiris simply could not make real inside his own mind. He believed in order too completely to believe in this particular kind of disorder. One evening they sat together in the way they had sat together 10,000 times before. The light was doing what it does over the Nile in the late afternoon, going gold and then orange, and then the deep red that turns the water, the color of something older than water. Osiris was talking. Isis was listening. The details do not matter. What matters is the quality of that hour, the specific weight of two people who have been so long together that their presence in the same room feels like a single thing. In a village somewhere in Egypt, a young couple sits outside their house the evening before their wedding. They have known each other their whole lives. They do not say much. The silence between them is comfortable. The silence of people who have run out of new things to say and discovered that this is not a problem, but a gift. Tomorrow the ceremony will happen, and the words will be spoken, and what has already been true for years will be made official. They sit in the last evening of before, and neither of them reaches for words because neither of them needs to. They do not know that the story their wedding draws from began with an evening just like this one, and that the evening just like this one was almost over. Isis looked at Osiris that night and she remembered him. The way the body remembers what matters before the mind catches up. She looked at him and stored the image somewhere deeper than thought. She did not know why. She would understand why later. Outside, in a workshop where a craftsman had finished his work and been paid and asked no further questions, a beautiful box sat waiting. Its dimensions were exact. Its decorations were perfect. Set had been patient for a long time. The occasion he had been waiting for was almost here. The party was Set's idea. Hold on to that. Set organized this. Set sent the invitations. Set chose the location and ordered the food and selected the wine and made sure that every detail of the evening communicated one thing above all others: generosity. The specific generosity of a powerful being who wants everyone in the room to feel that tonight. Of all nights, there is nowhere else in the world they would rather be. The guests arrived, and the room was everything Set had promised. Music from somewhere in the back, low enough to talk over. Tables arranged so that no one felt pushed to the edges. Torches placed at exactly the right height so that the light was warm without being harsh. Set moved through the room, greeting people, laughing at the right moments, filling cups before they were empty. He was magnificent at this. That is the part of the story that gets lost when people tell it quickly. Set was not a brooding figure standing in the corner with dark intentions written on his face. He was the best host in the room. He was present and warm and genuinely funny. The kind of person who made you feel, when he turned his attention to you, that you were the most interesting individual at the gathering. People who did not know him well left these occasions thinking they had the wrong idea about Set. He was nothing like what they expected. That was the point. Osiris was there. Of course, Osiris was there. This was his brother's party. And Osiris was the kind of person who showed up for his brother's party. He sat at the long table and ate and drank and talked to the people around him with the easy warmth of someone who had spent his life genuinely interested in other people. He laughed. He refilled his cup. He did not notice the particular quality of attention his brother was paying him from across the room. The evening moved the way good evenings move. Slowly at first, then all at once. The way time changes when you are surrounded by people you know, and the wine is good, and there is nowhere you have to be. Then Set gave a signal. It was subtle, a small gesture to someone standing near the far wall. Two servants disappeared through a doorway and came back carrying something between them, covered in linen cloth. They set it down in the open space at the center of the room, and Set waited for the conversation to quiet before he reached out and pulled the cloth away. The room went still. It was a chest, a box, made with craftsmanship that no one in the room had ever seen applied to such a thing. Cedar wood from Lebanon, dark and fragrant, the grain running in perfect parallel lines along the length of the lid, gold inlay along every edge, carvings of the Nile, of grain fields, of the sun moving across the sky in its daily journey, the images of a good life rendered in the most expensive materials available, wrapped around a box that was meant to hold the end of a life. It was the most beautiful thing in the room. Set let them look at it. He was generous with silence, the way he was generous with everything that evening. Then he smiled and said, "Whoever fits inside this, perfectly. It belongs to them." The laughter started immediately. Of course it did. This was a joke, clearly. A strange and slightly unusual joke. But Set had always had an edge to his humor, a willingness to go somewhere other people pulled back from. The wine was good, and the evening had been good, and the room was full of people who trusted the man throwing the party. The first person to try was a minor god near the end of the table, a young man who climbed in with exaggerated ceremony while his friends called out measurements. Too short. He stood up, grinning, and took a bow. The next person was taller and broader and did not fit at all. One shoulder sticking up above the rim in a way that made everyone laugh harder. It went around the room. Each attempt produced a different kind of not quite right. Too wide, too narrow, legs too long, and with each failure, the laughter built, the sense of shared absurdity that is one of the particular pleasures of a good party, the feeling that you are all in on something, together. Osiris watched from his place at the table. Someone near him said you should try. He looked at the chest. He looked at Set, who was watching him with an expression of perfect, open invitation, the expression of a brother who has done something nice and is waiting to see if his brother appreciates it. Osiris stood up. Here is where the story slows all the way down, because what happens next happens in the space of a few seconds, and those few seconds contain everything. Osiris walked to the chest. He sat on its edge, the way you sit on the edge of something before you commit to it fully. He looked inside. The interior was smooth and dark, and smelled of cedar, and something else underneath the cedar. Something faint that no one in the room was close enough to identify. He lay down. He fit perfectly. Of course he fit perfectly. Every measurement had been taken while he slept, or while he sat at a table, without knowing someone was watching the exact angle of his shoulders and the precise length of his spine. Every dimension of the chest had been calculated for this specific body. There was no accident here. There was no coincidence. There was only a plan executed with the patience and precision of someone who had spent a very long time learning how to wait. For one moment, Osiris lay in the chest and looked up at the ceiling of the room, and the torchlight was warm above him, and the faces of people he knew looked down at him smiling, and everything was fine. Then the lid came down. It did not slam. That is important. It came down quietly, with the controlled movement of something on a hinge designed to close exactly this way. Then the sound of the latches, one after another, clicking into place. The laughter in the room stopped. First, the people closest to the chest, then the ones behind them, until the room was completely silent, and everyone was looking at Set, and Set was looking at the chest, and his expression had not changed at all. That was the most frightening thing. His expression had not changed. He still looked like a man at his own party who was simply watching to see what would happen next. He poured the molten lead over the seams himself. The box with Osiris inside it was carried to the Nile and thrown into the water. The party was over. In a workshop, on the edge of a city, a craftsman is finishing another order. He is good at his work. He takes measurements carefully and builds to exact specifications, and does not ask questions about who the object is for or why the dimensions need to be so precise. He is paid well, and when he is finished, he will go home to his family and sleep without difficulty. He does not know that one day every coffin he builds will be built this way, with this same care, with measurements taken to fit the body of the person who will lie inside. He does not know that this attention to the specific dimensions of a specific human body will become one of the most sacred acts in his civilization. Set used craftsmanship as a trap. Egypt turned it into a blessing. That reversal is the whole story. In small, the chest hit the water and the current took it. The Nile, which had delivered so many promises, carried this one away into the dark. And Osiris, the king, who had made order feel permanent, who had spent his whole reign giving his people mornings they could count on, began moving toward a shore he had never seen. He had trusted the room. The room had been designed to be trusted. The sun came up the next morning. This is the detail that should stop you. The sun came up. The priests performed the morning rituals. The farmers walked to their fields. Children ran along the banks of the Nile the way they always ran, barefoot and loud, not going anywhere, in particular, just moving because they were young, and the morning was cool, and there was river to run beside. Bread was baked. Water was carried from the wells. A merchant in the delta was counting inventory he planned to trade later in the week. A woman in a village 3 days south of Memphis was teaching her daughter how to spin flax into thread. None of them knew. This is the part of the story that no retelling spends enough time on. The gap, the hours, and then the days between when the world changed and when the world found out. Osiris was in the Nile, moving north toward the sea in a sealed cedar box, and Egypt was going about its mourning as if the hinge that held everything together was still in place. Because that is how it works. Catastrophe does not announce itself. It happens in one room while the rest of the world is doing ordinary things. And the ordinary things continue for a while. Sometimes a long while, before the news arrives to change them. Set returned to the palace. He sat on the throne that was not his, and wore the expression of a man who had simply stepped in to manage things during a temporary absence. He told anyone who asked that Osiris had stepped away, that there was some matter requiring attention in another part of the kingdom, that everything was being handled. He was very convincing. He had been practicing for this his entire life. The Nile carried its secret north. The current was slow in some places, fast in others, moving the way rivers move when they have no opinion about what they are carrying. The sealed chest passed through the delta and into the wide mouth where the river spread itself across the land before meeting the sea. And then it was in the sea, moving with a different kind of current now. No longer the brown water of the Nile, but the deep blue of the Mediterranean, moving east and north toward a shore that was not Egypt at all. Isis did not find out through a messenger. She did not find out through a dream or a vision or any of the divine channels that stories like to give their characters when the plot needs them to know something. She found out the way people actually find out about the things that matter most, through the specific quality of an absence. Osiris was not there. She had felt his presence in the world the way you feel weather, the way a room changed when he entered it, the particular weight the air had when he was nearby. She had felt this her entire existence, had organized herself around it, the way the Nile organized itself around its banks. And then one morning she woke up, and the quality of the air was different. She went looking for him with her eyes first, through the corridors, the audience halls, the garden, where he sometimes walked in the early morning when the light was still uncertain. She told herself she was being foolish. She told herself there was a reasonable explanation. She looked at Set. Set looked back at her. He did not say anything. He did not have to. His face was completely composed, completely present, the face of a man who has done nothing and has nothing to explain. But underneath the composure, in the specific quality of his steadiness, there was something that told her what she needed to know. She understood. She did not cry. She did not speak. She turned away from Set's steady gaze and walked out of the room and kept walking until she was outside. And then she stood in the open air of Egypt and breathed and let the world settle into its new shape. The Nile moved north. The chest moved with it. The sun tracked its path across the sky the way it always did, with the magnificent indifference of something that has been doing the same thing for longer than any of the dramas happening beneath it. Somewhere in the sea north of Egypt, a cedar box was moving toward a coast it had never been aimed at. Inside the box, Osiris was still. The gold inlay caught no light. The carvings of grain fields and the good life had nothing to illuminate them in the dark. Outside, Egypt continued. It did not know yet that the king was gone. It did not know yet that the person standing in the palace pretending to manage things was the person who had ended him. It did not know yet that everything it trusted about the permanence of order had just been tested in the most fundamental way possible. It knew only that the morning had come, the way mornings always came, reliable and golden, carrying the promise that Set was in the dark, killing the serpent that wanted to end the world. Set was not in the dark. He was on the throne, and the serpent, for the moment, was unguarded. She did not have a plan. This is the part that gets rewritten in every retelling. The part where Isis becomes a divine detective with a strategy already formed. A goddess who knew exactly what she was doing from the moment she understood what had happened. That version is cleaner. It is also wrong. What she had, standing outside the palace in the morning air of Egypt, with the knowledge of what Set had done settling into her bones, was not a plan. It was a refusal. A single, quiet, absolute refusal to let the story end the way Set had written it. She stood there and looked out at Egypt and understood something that would have broken a smaller person. There was no one coming to fix this. There was no divine authority above Set that she could appeal to. No mechanism in place for exactly this situation. No protocol for what happened when the king of the universe was murdered by his own brother, and the murderer was now sitting on the throne, looking reasonable. The structure that was supposed to protect against this had been penetrated at its highest level. If anything was going to happen, she was going to have to make it happen herself. She was not prepared for this. She had spent her existence as the complement to a king, the intelligence behind a throne, the magic that supported the authority her husband held. She had never been the one who held the authority alone. She had never operated without him. She thought about Set on the throne. She thought about what he would do if he knew she was looking for Osiris. She thought about Osiris, somewhere in the Nile or beyond it, sealed in a box that no one except Set knew the location of. Then she stopped thinking about what she did not have and started thinking about what she did. She had the most comprehensive knowledge of how the world worked of any being in existence. She could speak the hidden names of things and make them respond. She understood the deep structure beneath the visible surface of reality in a way that even the other gods did not fully share. These were not small gifts. In the particular crisis in front of her, they might be the only gifts that mattered. She also had something that was not a divine power at all, but was, in this situation, just as important. She was willing to start without knowing how it ended. She disguised herself, not with elaborate magic. Though she could have, she simply changed her appearance enough to move without being recognized. Made herself look like a woman traveling alone with no particular destination. The kind of person who passes through a place and leaves no memory of having been there. Then she walked out of the palace and into Egypt and began. The search did not start dramatically. She had no map and no certain knowledge of where Set had put the chest. She had only the logic of water. The Nile moved north. The Nile reached the sea. The sea had currents that moved in patterns she could trace if she followed them far enough. She began at the banks of the delta and asked questions of everyone she met. Fishermen, ferry operators, people who spent their lives watching the river and knew its moods and the particular way it moved things it carried. Most of them did not know what they had seen. A box, something large and sealed, moving with the current in the middle of the night. Someone who had been working late at the water's edge and noticed something strange and filed it away as one of those things the Nile sometimes carried. The inexplicable debris of a world that was always losing and finding its own pieces. She followed the thread north and then out to sea. She followed it the way you follow something when you do not know if you are getting closer or moving sideways or walking in a circle, with the stubborn, methodical patience of someone who has decided that stopping is worse than continuing, even when continuing is hard. A woman stands in her house 3 weeks after her husband has died. The formal period of mourning is over. The priests have come and gone. The neighbors have come and gone. The food people brought in the first days has been eaten. The house has settled back into the quiet of a single person living in a space that was built for two. She stands in the middle of the main room and looks around and tries to figure out what to do next. There is no instruction for this. There is no ritual that covers the specific feeling of the first ordinary morning after everyone has stopped treating you as someone in crisis and you are simply expected to resume. She stands there for a long time. Then she takes one step toward the door. She does not know where she is going. She goes because standing still feels like giving something up that she is not ready to give up yet. Isis did not go looking for her husband because she had a plan. She went because the alternative was to stand in the palace and accept that Set had written the ending. And that was the one thing she was absolutely unwilling to do. Because he was Osiris. Because he was hers. Because the world without him in it had a specific wrongness at its center. And she could feel that wrongness in every breath she took. And she was the only person who both knew it was there and had any possibility of doing something about it. She moved north. The trail moved with her. Somewhere ahead. Beyond the sea. In a city that had no idea what it was holding. A cedar tree had grown up around a sealed chest, and a king who was waiting. Without knowing he was waiting. To be found. The city was called Byblos, a port city on the coast of what we now call Lebanon, one of the oldest, continuously inhabited places in the world. A city that had been trading with Egypt for so long that the two cultures had worn grooves in each other's thinking. Egyptian goods moved through Byblos. Byblos timber, the famous cedar of Lebanon, moved into Egypt. The relationship between them was so old and so established that it had become invisible, the way old things become invisible. Part of the architecture of how the world worked, rather than a fact anyone thought about. In later accounts, the chest reached the shore of Byblos and settled in the shallow water at the edge of the beach. And then something happened that the story records without explanation. The way stories sometimes record the things that matter most without explaining why they matter. A tree grew up around it. Tamarisk. The kind that grows where salt water meets fresh water, where the land is not quite land and the sea is not quite sea. It grew with unusual speed and unusual intention, its trunk wrapping around the chest, its branches spreading outward like arms reaching for something, until the chest was not just on the shore, but inside the tree, encased in living wood, held there the way a hand holds something it does not want to lose. The king of Byblos saw the tamarisk from his palace and was struck by it. This happened sometimes. A particular tree that caught the light in a particular way and became, for reasons no one could fully explain, the most beautiful thing you had ever seen in a landscape full of ordinary things. He sent men to cut it down and bring it to the palace, where it would become a pillar in the great hall. The pillar was installed. It was everything the king had hoped it would be. Visitors to the great hall remarked on it. The grain of the wood caught the torchlight beautifully. The pillar held up its section of the roof with what seemed like unusual dignity, a quality of presence that ordinary wood did not usually have. No one knew why. The king of the greatest civilization on earth was sealed inside the central pillar of a foreign palace, and no one who walked past it every day had any idea. Isis arrived in Byblos the way she had been traveling. Quietly, without ceremony, she came to the city as a lone woman with no obvious status, and she sat down by the well near the palace gate, which was where women came in the late afternoon to draw water, and she waited. The queen's attendants came, as they came every afternoon, and found a stranger sitting by the well. She was not what they expected a stranger to look like. She sat with a particular quality of stillness that made the air around her different, and when she looked at them, she looked with the full attention of someone who finds the person they are looking at genuinely interesting, which is rarer than it sounds and more affecting than it should be. She braided their hair. This is what the story says, and it is a small detail but an important one. She braided their hair and breathed on them, and they went back to the palace carrying something that no one in Byblos could name, something sweeter and older than any perfume available in the markets of the coast. The queen noticed. The queen asked. The attendants described the woman by the well. The queen sent for her. Isis came to the palace and became the nurse of the royal infant. She was good at this. The way she was good at everything that required understanding how things actually worked beneath their surface appearance. The child responded to her the way children respond to people who are fully present with them, with complete and trusting openness. At night, she placed the child in fire. The queen found her doing this. The queen screamed. The queen's scream broke something in the room, some quality of concentrated intention that could not be rebuilt once it had been interrupted. Isis stood up to her full height, which was not a human height, and the fire went out, and the child was unharmed. And the Queen of Byblos understood for the first time that she had been hosting something considerably larger than a traveling nurse. Isis told the queen what she was and why she had come. The king of Byblos brought her to the great hall himself. He stood with her before the central pillar, the one he had admired for its particular dignity, and told her she could take whatever she needed. Isis put her hands on the pillar. She felt what was inside it. She asked the room to be cleared. The king and the queen and all their attendants withdrew, and the doors of the great hall closed, and Isis stood alone in a foreign palace with her husband sealed inside a pillar of living wood, in a city that did not know what it had been keeping for her. The detail of Byblos is one that many retellings leave out, and it is worth staying with for a moment, because Osiris, in a foreign pillar, held by a tree in a city across the sea, is not a small thing. It means that the story of Osiris did not stay inside Egypt. It means that the search went further than any search should have to go. It means that a woman who had just lost her husband had to travel to another country and work as a servant in a palace and care for a stranger's child and wait, with no guarantee of anything, for the moment when the thing she was looking for would reveal itself. She took the chest out of the pillar and held it and did not let go for a long time. Then she began the journey back to Egypt. She needed to get home. She needed to perform the rituals that Osiris needed. She needed to move quickly. Before Set found out what she had done, she did not move quickly enough. Isis brought the chest back to Egypt and hid it in the delta marshes. This was the right decision. The delta was the part of Egypt that was neither fully land nor fully water. A vast network of channels and reed beds and shallow pools spreading across the northern edge of the country, where the Nile divided itself into fingers before reaching the sea. It was a place of extraordinary life, full of birds and fish and the kind of dense, wet vegetation that swallowed whatever entered it. A sealed chest in the delta marshes was as close to invisible as anything in Egypt could be. She set it down in the reeds. She covered it with the care you give to something you are leaving temporarily. Then she left to find Nephthys, or to gather what she needed for the rituals, or to do whatever the next step required. The story is not specific about where she went. And the reason the story is not specific is that where she went does not matter. What matters is that she left, and Set was hunting. He had been hunting since the night of the party. In the methodical way, he did everything, covering the ground systematically, following the logic of water the same way Isis had followed it north. He was the god of the desert and of the spaces between ordered things. The delta marshes were exactly the kind of place his nature understood. The place where the land dissolved into water and the categories stopped working and things could hide in the ambiguity between one thing and another. He found the chest on a night when the moon was enough to see by. Set looked at his brother sealed inside the cedar box and felt something that the story does not name. He was not the kind of god who announced what he felt. He was the kind of god who looked at a situation and made a calculation. And the calculation was this. Isis had found the chest once. She could find it again. The chest where it was represented an unfinished problem. Osiris, in a sealed chest, still represented a body that could be recovered. A king who could be ritually restored. A story that could be continued by the right person, with the right knowledge. Isis was the right person. She had the knowledge. She had already proven she was willing to cross a sea and spend months in a foreign city, caring for a stranger's child to get to this chest. She would not stop now. Set reached into the chest. What he did next was not done in anger. Anger would have been easier to understand. What he did was done in the cold, calculating intelligence of someone who understood that the problem was not the body. The problem was the possibility the body represented, the possibility of restoration, the possibility that Isis could take this body and perform the rituals and bring Osiris back in some form. Some diminished or transformed form, but still recognizably Osiris, still carrying the authority and the legitimacy that the name Osiris carried. If there was no intact body, there could be no ritual restoration. Set divided the body into 14 parts and scattered them across Egypt. The story does not linger on the specifics of this, and neither will we. What matters is not the physical detail, but the strategic logic. 14 pieces distributed across the length and breadth of a country that stretched from the Mediterranean coast to the mountains far to the south. Some pieces in the desert, some in the marshes, some in cities, some in places so remote that a person could spend months looking and not find them. 14 problems, each one requiring its own search, each one separated from the others by distances that would take weeks to travel. One piece never came back. This is what the story says, and it says it without embellishment, the way you say things that are simply true and do not need to be made more dramatic than they are. One piece was taken by the Nile, carried away by the current and the deep indifference of a river that does not distinguish between what matters and what does not. It was gone in the way that some things are simply gone, and no amount of searching or magic or refusal to accept the loss could change that. Isis later made a replacement, shaped carefully, placed where it belonged, serving the function of what was lost, but the original was gone. This is the detail that no love and no divine persistence could change. Osiris would be restored. The rituals would work. The story would continue, but it would continue with a piece missing, with a made replacement standing in for something that could not be recovered. And the restored Osiris would not be identical to the Osiris who had lain in the cedar chest in Byblos. Set could not make him disappear entirely, but he could make sure that what came back was not exactly what had been taken. He scattered the pieces and walked away from the delta marshes and returned to the palace where he was managing things in the king's absence. He sat on the throne and composed his expression and waited for morning. In the morning he would hold court and make decisions and speak in the careful language of a regent who expects the king to return soon. He had been practicing this language for weeks. The delta was silent around what remained of Osiris. The reeds moved in the night wind. The Nile birds called to each other across the dark water. Somewhere in Egypt, a priest unrolls a sheet of papyrus and reads aloud. His voice is steady and practiced, the voice of someone who has said these words so many times they have become part of his breathing. He reads, "Your bones are gathered together. Your limbs are joined. You are made whole." He reads these words over a body wrapped in linen in a room lit by oil lamps. He does not know that the words were written because of this night. He does not know that somewhere in the reed beds of the delta, in pieces scattered by a god who understood that the most dangerous kind of erasure is not destruction but dispersal, the person these words were first written for is waiting to be found. The words were written because someone looked at the impossible and decided to make a map for getting through it. Set thought he had ended the story. He had only made it harder. Isis came back to the delta and found the chest empty. She knew immediately what had happened, because there was only one person who knew where the chest was, and only one reason to open it. And the evidence of what had been done was not subtle. The chest was open, and the delta was silent, in the particular way that places are silent after something violent has moved through them. She stood in the reeds and understood the full scale of what she was facing. 14 pieces, scattered across the largest country in the ancient world, by a god who knew the terrain as well as she did, and had a significant head start and no interest in making any of this easy. Each piece hidden in a different place, each location unknown, and underneath all of this, the time pressure that Set's control of the throne created. She could not move openly. She could not ask for divine assistance through official channels, because the official channels were currently controlled by the person who had done this. She had to search in secret, piece by piece, across the whole of Egypt, while Set sat in the palace and watched for any sign that she was making progress. She went north first, because the north was where the chest had been, and the pieces closest to the hiding place had probably not been moved far. The logic of how you scatter something when you are working quickly is that the pieces near the center of the action move the least distance, because you run out of time and energy before you run out of malice. She was right. The first piece she found was in the marshes, not far from where the chest had been. She recognized it the way you recognize something that belongs to a person you have known your entire existence, not through rational identification, but through the specific knowledge that lives below thought. She carried it with her and kept moving. The search took months. The stories fold this time into a few sentences. The way stories compress the parts that are necessary but unglamorous. She searched. She found. The pieces came together. But the reality of those months is worth staying with for a moment, because the reality is where the meaning lives. Isis walked through Egypt, looking for her husband. She walked through cities and through desert stretches, and through the fertile black land of the delta, and through the narrow band of green along the Nile that gave way on both sides to rock and sand. She asked questions of people who could not have known what they had seen or why it mattered. She followed directions that were uncertain and sometimes wrong, and had to double back and try again. She slept in places that were not safe, and ate what was available, and kept moving, because stopping was not something she was willing to do. At each place where she found a piece, she stayed long enough to honor what she had found, not with elaborate ritual, not with the kind of ceremony that required an audience, but with the quiet attention of someone who understands that the things we find, after long searching, deserve to be met with presence rather than hurry. At each of these places, something changed in the land. The Egyptians noticed this, not immediately, not all at once, but over the years and decades that followed. The places where Isis had stopped and stayed and honored what she found had a particular quality to them, a fertility and a presence that the surrounding land did not share. People began to build temples at these locations, not because anyone told them to, because the land itself seemed to call for it, seemed to want the same thing Isis had given it, which was attention, recognition, the acknowledgement that something significant had happened here and deserved to be remembered. The map of Egypt became, in this way, a map of Osiris. Every temple at every location where a piece had been found was a marker on that map, a way of saying this is where part of him was, this is where she found him, this is where the search continued. One piece was never found. Isis searched the delta water for it and could not find it, because it was gone in the way that some things are simply gone, taken by the current and the deep indifference of a river that does not distinguish between what matters and what does not. She searched for a long time before she accepted this, before she sat on the bank of the Nile and understood that she had done everything possible and one thing was still impossible. She made a replacement and carried it with the others and kept going. Every year in the city of Abydos, which sits in the middle of Egypt and which tradition held was the place where his head had been found, the people performed a mystery, not a performance exactly, not a theatrical production with professional actors and scripted lines, a mystery in the older sense, a ritual enactment of the events of the story, carried out by ordinary people who had been chosen for the roles. A farmer played Osiris. A blacksmith played Set. A young woman with dark hair who had never been outside the city limits played Isis. They wore the appropriate colors and carried the appropriate symbols and moved through the sequence of events that the story required. The death and the search and the finding and the grief and the restoration. The crowd watched in silence that was different from ordinary silence. The silence of people who are not watching a story but participating in one, who are not separated from what is happening by the comfortable distance of an audience, but pulled into it by the specific weight of what the story is about. Everyone in Abydos had lost someone. That was the fact underneath the festival. Everyone there had stood in a room after a death and felt the specific disorientation of the world reorganizing itself around an absence. Everyone there had performed the rituals and said the words and done everything that was supposed to be done, and had still gone home to a house that felt wrong in all the places where it used to feel right. The story of Isis searching for Osiris was their story. The search was their search. The refusal to accept that the pieces could not be gathered was their refusal. This is why it had to be told every year, to give people somewhere to put the grief that had no other container, to say the God who made order possible was broken apart. The person who loved him refused to let that be the end. And the world we live in now, with its temples and its rituals and its way of honoring the dead, was built from that refusal. Set thought he had made the search impossible by making it large enough. He thought that 14 pieces across the whole of Egypt was a problem too big for any single being to solve. He was wrong about what Isis could hold. He was wrong about what love, operating at full capacity, without distraction or self-preservation, could accomplish in a country it knew as well as its own body. There was no stopping point. She gathered the pieces of the person she loved from the 4 directions of a country that had become a map of his absence, and she brought them together, and she began. Nephthys came. This is the part of the story that gets the least attention and deserves considerably more. Not because Nephthys did something dramatic, not because she arrived with power or a plan or anything that moves a plot forward in the way stories expect their characters to move plots forward, but because of what her presence meant, given who she was and who she was married to. Nephthys was Set's wife. She came anyway. The story does not give us a scene where she makes this decision. There is no moment of anguished deliberation. No conversation with Set where she tells him what she is going to do. No dramatic exit from the palace. The story simply records that when Isis needed her, Nephthys was there, as if this were the only possible outcome, as if everything else about who Nephthys was made this the inevitable choice. She was the goddess of the household, of shelter and protection and the quiet constancy of a space that holds people together. In another kind of story, this would have made her the conservative force, the one who preserved the institution of her marriage above whatever the institution contained. In this story, it made her the one who understood that some things were more important than the institution. She came to Isis in the Delta, and she sat down beside the body of Osiris, and she did not pretend that what had been done to him was acceptable. This is what courage looks like when it is not dramatic. It looks like sitting down. The two of them sat beside what Isis had gathered, and they mourned. The Egyptian word for this, the specific ritualized mourning that Isis and Nephthys performed, carried more weight than simple grief. It was an active thing, a doing. The sound of lamentation in the Egyptian tradition was not the uncontrolled expression of private pain. It was a practice, a deliberate act performed with intention, with the understanding that the sound of grief performed with full commitment could do something in the world beyond expressing that you were sad. Isis and Nephthys called Osiris back. The pieces that had been scattered, the identity that had been dispersed across 14 locations and the length of a country, began to respond to the sound of 2 voices, refusing to accept that dispersal was permanent. The Egyptians understood something about grief that the modern world has largely lost. Grief is not the opposite of function. It is not the breakdown of the person who feels it. Grief, performed fully and without apology, is one of the most powerful things a human being can do. It is the act of saying this person existed, this person mattered. The world is not the same without them, and I will not pretend that it is. I will make noise about the difference. I will not let the silence swallow what the silence wants to swallow. Isis and Nephthys sat beside Osiris and made noise. They were not performing for an audience. There was no audience. They were doing what the situation required, which was the full expression of what the loss of Osiris meant, without the social editing that grief usually undergoes when it is performed in front of other people. The unguarded, completely honest expression of what it meant that this had happened. This moment became the template for every funeral in Egypt for the next 3,000 years. Every time an Egyptian died, there were women who performed this role, not simply family members who happened to be weeping, but practitioners of a specific art, women who had learned, from the tradition that Isis and Nephthys had established, how to perform grief with the full weight it required. They were called the kites, after the birds of prey that circled above the battlefield and cried out in voices that carried across large distances. They went to every funeral, rich households, poor households, farmers and merchants and priests and soldiers and children who did not live long enough to have an occupation. The kites came, and they did what Isis and Nephthys had done, which was to sit beside the dead person and refuse to let the silence swallow them. In a room in a city in Egypt, two women in white linen are sitting on either side of a body. The family stands nearby and watches. The women begin to speak, and then to sing, and then the singing becomes something that is not quite singing and not quite speaking, but something in between, something that the body knows before the mind does, that opens a space in the chest that ordinary language cannot open. The family watches and understands that they are seeing something very old, something that was being done before any of them were born, before their parents were born, before the city they live in existed. They are watching a practice that began beside the broken body of a god in a delta marsh, performed by his wife and his wife's sister, in the dark, with no audience, because it was what the moment required. The women in white are not Isis and Nephthys, but they are doing what Isis and Nephthys did. The chain of doing connects them backward through time to that original night, and forward through time to every funeral that will happen after this one. The chain is made not of shared blood or shared theology, but of shared practice. The repeated act of sitting beside someone who has died and refusing to be silent about it. Nephthys stayed for all of it. This is the thing about Nephthys that the story asks you to hold. She was not the one with the magic, or the plan, or the divine cleverness that the situation ultimately required. She was the one who stayed. Through the searching and the gathering and the sitting and the mourning and everything that followed, she was present, not because it was safe, not because it was easy, not because it advanced any personal agenda. She stayed because Isis needed someone to sit beside her, because grief is not something you can perform alone without it becoming something else, something smaller and harder and less honest than what it needs to be when you do it in the presence of someone who understands what you have lost. The two of them mourned together until the mourning had done what mourning does when it is allowed to run its full course. It did not end the grief. Grief does not end, but it completed the specific act of acknowledging what had been lost, which is the only foundation from which any of the next steps are possible. Then Isis wiped her face and stood up. There was work to do. Someone else came to the delta. He came quietly, the way he always came, the way the nature of his function required, not with announcement, not with the kind of arrival that draws attention. He came with his equipment and his knowledge, and the particular composure of someone who has been present at the most difficult human moments so many times that he has found a way to be fully present without being destroyed by what he witnesses. His head was that of a jackal, black fur, upright ears, eyes that caught the low light and held it. His body was that of a man. He was Anubis. He has been called the god of death. This is not quite right. Or at least it misses the most important part of what he was. He was not the force that ended life. He was the presence that managed the transition, the god of the threshold, of the specific space between one state of being and another, the space that needs a guide because it is too dark and too disorienting to navigate alone. He had come because this was exactly the kind of situation his nature was built for. Anubis stood in the delta marsh and looked at the gathered pieces of Osiris and began. What he was doing had never been done before. The specific problem in front of him had never existed before. A divine body had been killed and scattered and gathered again. And the question of how to restore it, how to make it cohere into something that could serve the functions a divine body needed to serve, had no precedent. He was, in the most literal sense, inventing the answer as he went. The Egyptians understood mummification in a way that gets lost when the process is described in purely technical terms. The point was not simply to preserve the body from decay, though that is what it accomplished. The point was to keep the body recognizable, to maintain enough of the form that the soul, when it needed to find its way back, would recognize itself. The Egyptians believed the soul was not a single thing. It had components, each with a different function. The Ka was the life force, the animating energy that made a person alive. The Ba was the individual personality, the specific collection of traits and memories and ways of being that made you, you, rather than someone else. For the Ba to reunite with the Ka after death, it needed to find the body. The body was the address. The recognizable form was the location. Anubis was solving an address problem. He worked with the gathered pieces for a long time. The physical acts and the ritual acts were the same acts. Washing, wrapping, treating, preserving were simultaneously material and spiritual. The Egyptians did not draw the distinction between those two categories that we draw now. Natron, the natural salt that Egypt produced in abundance near its lakes, drew the moisture from the body and slowed the processes that would otherwise dissolve it into the earth. The specific plants and resins used had properties that preserved and protected. The wrapping was done in layers. White linen, the color of purity, the color of things that had been cleaned, of whatever darkness clung to them. Between the layers, small objects were placed, amulets, words written on strips of material and folded into the wrappings. Each step was accompanied by words spoken aloud. The voice committed to what the hands were doing. The hands enacted what the voice declared. Together, they created something that neither could create separately. A teacher is training a student in an old skill. The skill has been passed down for so many generations that no one can trace it back to its origin. The teacher shows the student the angle of the hand, the specific motion that the task requires, the way you hold what you are working with so that you are in control without being rigid, present without forcing. The student watches and then tries. The teacher corrects. The student tries again. The knowledge moves from one pair of hands to another the way it has always moved. In the body itself, in the muscle memory of a motion performed correctly until it becomes the only natural way to perform it. Somewhere in the chain of hands that this knowledge has passed through is the hand of Anubis, doing this for the first time, in a delta marsh, with no teacher and no tradition to draw from, inventing the motion because the situation required it and there was no one else to invent it. The student's hands begin to find the right angle. The teacher nods. The knowledge continues. Anubis finished his work and stepped back. The thing that had been scattered and gathered and made whole again rested in the forms he had built around it. The linen was white. The amulets were in their correct positions. The words had been spoken. He had done what he had come to do. Without Anubis, The 14 pieces Isis had gathered from the 4 directions of Egypt would have remained pieces. The ritual that Isis was about to perform would have had nothing to work with. The restoration that was coming, partial as it was, incomplete as it necessarily had to be, would have been impossible. He had built the container. What filled it was something else entirely. Isis stood over the body that Anubis had prepared. She spread her wings. This is how the story describes it. And it is the image that Egyptian art returns to again and again across 3,000 years. The woman with wings extended over the wrapped body. Both shelter and the thing that shelter becomes when it is offered with full intention. She spoke the words that only she knew how to speak. And in the body that Anubis had preserved, something moved. What happened in the Delta Marsh that night is the part of the story that Egyptian art chose to show rather than describe. The images are everywhere, on temple walls and papyrus scrolls, and the decorated surfaces of coffins that held ordinary people who wanted this particular image close to them in death. A woman with wings spread wide, hovering over a wrapped male figure. Her face turned toward him with an expression that the painters rendered differently in different centuries, but always with the same essential quality. The expression of someone doing the most important thing they have ever done, and knowing it. Isis restored enough of Osiris to conceive a child. This is how the story says it. She used her knowledge of the hidden workings of things, the magic that was not tricks, but understanding, to bring Osiris back across the border between the living and the dead just far enough, just long enough, for life to pass between them. The child would be Horus. Take a moment with what this means in the story's logic, because it is doing something very specific. The Egyptians were not telling a story about miraculous reproduction for its own sake. They were making a claim about where Horus came from. He came from the intersection. He was born from the space between the living world and the dead, which meant he belonged to both, which meant he carried both kinds of authority. The authority of the living king, the inheritance from his father's throne, and the connection to Osiris in his new domain. In the Egyptian imagination, every pharaoh who came after Osiris was understood to be Horus while they lived. Every pharaoh was understood to become Osiris when they died. The living king and the dead king, the throne of Egypt and the throne beneath the earth. The myth was not just a story about the past. It was the blueprint for every transition of power that Egypt would ever have. But that is later. In the marsh that night, it was simpler and heavier than that. A woman who had lost her husband, who had crossed a sea and walked the length of a country and sat in the dark with her grief and refused to be done, had found a way to carry something of him forward. She could not bring him back. The Osiris, who had walked through rooms and made people feel safe and taught the world how to grow grain, that Osiris was not coming back. But something of him could continue. She held that possibility in her body and began to walk. She needed to find a place to hide. Set did not know yet what had happened in the marsh. But Set had intelligence, and Set understood that Isis was still in Egypt and still a problem. When he found out what she had managed to do, his response would be immediate and thorough. She needed to be somewhere he would not think to look before he found out. She went to the interior channels of the delta, where the reed beds were so dense that the sky disappeared, and the world reduced itself to water and green, and the sounds of birds that lived their whole lives without seeing dry land. She made herself a shelter in the reeds the way the reed birds made their nests, low to the water, woven into the plants around it, so that from any distance it looked like part of the landscape. She waited. The months that followed were not the months of a goddess living in exile. They were the months of a woman alone in a difficult place, doing what needed to be done each day, carrying what she was carrying, not knowing how the larger story would resolve, but knowing that the resolution required her to stay alive and hidden until the child was born. She was not comfortable. She was not entirely safe. Set searched for her, and came close enough on certain nights that the sound of his searching moved through the reeds, and she lay still and did not breathe more than was necessary. She was completely alone with the knowledge of what she was doing and why. Somewhere below the world, in the place that Osiris now inhabited. Osiris knew. The story does not explain how. It simply asserts it, the way it asserts all the things that matter most, without mechanism or qualification. Osiris knew that Isis was in the marshes. He knew what she was carrying. He knew the child was coming. He could not cross back to where she was. Whatever Isis had done that night in the delta, it had been possible once and would not be possible again. The border between the living and the dead was not a door you could open from the inside. He could know she was there. He could not reach her. There is a kind of knowing that people carry when someone they love is somewhere they cannot go. A child sick in a city far away, while the parent sits at home and feels the wrongness in the air without being able to name its source. A child in danger, while the parent goes through ordinary motions and keeps stopping, keeps putting things down, keeps standing at windows. Osiris felt the marshes where Isis was the way you feel weather through a wall. He could not see it. He could not touch it. He knew it was there. The child was born in the reed shelter, in the interior marshes of the delta. In the dark, with no one present but Isis and whatever help she could find in the prayers she had carried with her. He was small, and he was alive, and his name was Horus. He did not come into a kingdom. He came into a reed shelter in the marshes with a mother who was exhausted and alone, and holding him with the grip of someone who understands that what they are holding is the entire future and the entire reason and the only thing that makes any of the preceding months make sense. She looked at him. He had his father's particular quality of presence, that specific weight that Osiris had always had in a room, the quality that made people feel that somewhere behind them something was steady. He had it already, newborn, in the reeds, with the sound of the marsh birds around him. He had it already. She named him and held him and understood what the next part of her life was going to be. It was not going to be easier than the part that had just ended. In some ways, it was going to be considerably harder, because the thing she was protecting now was no longer a memory or a hope, but a person, small and specific and completely dependent on her for everything. Set could not know that Horus existed. Not yet. She pulled the reeds tighter around the shelter and held her son and stayed very still. Above the marshes, the stars moved in the patterns they always moved in, the same stars that had been moving in those patterns since before Egypt had a name. Osiris, beneath the world. You felt the weight of the new life in the marshes, the way you feel a change in weather. Something had shifted. Something was in the world that had not been there before. He could not cross back to see it. That was enough. For now, it was enough. The marshes were not safe. The delta marshes of Egypt were one of the most biologically active environments in the ancient world, which is another way of saying they were full of things that killed. Crocodiles in the deeper channels, scorpions in the reed beds, snakes of multiple varieties, moving through the shallow water and the dense vegetation with the unhurried confidence of creatures that had no natural enemies. Horus grew up in the middle of all of this. He was stung by a scorpion before he was old enough to understand what a scorpion was. He was bitten by things he could not see. He ran fevers in the reed shelter that turned the days into a single confused moment that went on for longer than a child should have to endure. He fell into the deep channels more than once, because children fall into things. And the deep channels of the delta contained crocodiles that had been waiting at the bottom of them since before any of the current drama was relevant to anyone. Each time something happened, Isis solved it. She solved it the way you solve problems when you are the only resource available, which is to use everything you know, try everything you can think of, and refuse to accept that the problem is unsolvable until you have genuinely run out of ideas. She called on knowledge she had carried for her entire existence and had never had occasion to use in exactly this way. She kept him alive. The stories that survive from this period are small and specific. The way the details of a difficult time are always small and specific when you look back at them from a distance. A scorpion sting that should have been fatal and was not. A fever that broke on a night when there was no logical reason for it to break. A crocodile that passed the reed shelter and did not stop. In a village somewhere in Egypt, a mother is sitting beside her sick child in the middle of the night. The child's fever has been climbing for 2 days. She has done everything she knows how to do. She has given him the remedies that her mother gave her and her mother's mother gave her mother. She has called in the local healer, who has done what healers do and gone home. And now it is the deepest part of the night, and the child's breathing is not what she wants it to be, and she is sitting beside him because there is nowhere else to be. She begins to speak. She says words that were given to her by the women who raised her. Words that have been passed from mother to mother for so many generations that no one can trace their origin. Words that call on the memory of Isis in the marshes. On the night Isis sat beside her own son and refused to let him die. The woman in the village does not know if the words work. She knows only that they have been said before, by people she trusted, in situations like this one. She says them because saying them is the last thing she knows how to do, and she is not ready to stop doing things. She says them until dawn. The child's fever breaks as the sun comes up. Horus grew. The child who could not walk became the child who could not be stopped from running. The child who could not feed himself became the child who was into everything and had to be watched every moment, because the moment you stopped watching was the moment he found the thing most likely to kill him and treated it as an interesting discovery. Isis watched him and taught him. Everything she knew, she gave to him. Not in formal lessons, but in the way knowledge passes between people who live together and share every hour of the day. Through demonstration and correction, and the 1,000 small moments of a child paying attention to an adult who is worth paying attention to, she taught him who his father was. This is the education that mattered most, and was also the most difficult. How do you give a child a father who is not there? How do you make real for a child the person who should be the most real presence in his life, and is instead an absence so large it has the quality of a presence? Isis did not soften this. She did not make Osiris into a comfortable story or a distant legend. She made him specific. She told Horus things about Osiris that no one else knew. The particular weight of his attention in a room, and the way he laughed, and the specific quality of silence he created when he was thinking through a problem. She gave him a father made of memory rather than presence. It was not the same thing. It was the best thing available. Horus listened with the specific quality of attention that children pay to things they understand matter, taking in not just the content, but the emotion underneath the content. The reason the person speaking is telling them this rather than something else. He understood, before he had the words for it, that he was carrying something forward, that his existence was not just his own existence, but the continuation of something that had been interrupted, that the world had a wrongness at its center, and he was, somehow, the person who was supposed to address it. This is a large thing to know about yourself at a young age. The children who grow up knowing they are carrying something forward do not have easier childhoods than the children who do not know this. They have more serious ones, more shadowed, more organized around a future that has not arrived yet, but that already has the weight of necessity. Set did not know the child existed. The marshes were very good at keeping secrets. The reed beds swallowed sound. The channels confused direction. Isis watched the horizon every day. She was waiting for the moment when Horus was ready. She would recognize it when it came. The way you recognize all the important moments. Not because they announce themselves, but because something in you that has been waiting without knowing it was waiting, suddenly understands that now is when. That moment had not come yet, but it was getting closer every day. Horus left the marshes. He was grown now, or grown enough. The specific age does not matter, and the stories do not agree on it anyway. What matters is that one morning Isis looked at her son, standing at the edge of the reed shelter, with his face turned toward the horizon. And she understood that the waiting was over. Not because she was ready. She was not sure she would ever be ready. But because he was. And because, ready or not, the world outside the marshes was not going to fix itself. He walked out of the delta and into Egypt. Set heard about it almost immediately. This is how it works when you control a country. Information moves toward the person at the center, the way water moves toward a drain. Someone saw a young man come out of the interior marshes with his mother's intelligence in his eyes and his father's quality of presence in the way he held his body. And word moved north to the palace with the speed that important news always moves. Set was not surprised. He had known this day was coming. He had spent years knowing it was coming. In the way you know about things you cannot prevent, but can prepare for. He had his throne and his army, and the accumulated weight of years of actual governance. The institutional legitimacy that comes from having been in charge long enough that people have organized their lives around your being in charge. Horus had a name, his father's name, the name that Egypt had organized its entire understanding of order and kingship around for as long as anyone could remember. What followed was not a single battle. This is the part that most retellings compress, because single battles are narratively satisfying, and the truth is not. The conflict between Horus and Set lasted for a very long time. Some traditions say 80 years, which is probably not literal, but is communicating something true about the nature of the conflict, which is that it was not resolvable quickly and was not resolved by a single, decisive moment. It went back and forth. Horus gained ground. Set regained it. The line between them moved in both directions, over years, and then over more years. Set was not a weak opponent. He was the god who killed the serpent that wanted to end the world every single night. He had been doing this for longer than the conflict with Horus had existed. He brought to the fighting with Horus the same cold, inexhaustible commitment he brought to everything. The patience of someone who had been in difficult positions before and knew how to hold. Horus brought something different. He brought the specific anger of a person who knows exactly what was taken and exactly who took it. The cold anger that organizes itself into purpose and becomes, over time, more effective than the hot kind because it does not exhaust its fuel. He also brought his mother's intelligence, which meant he did not fight Set the way Set expected to be fought. One afternoon, on a stretch of ground that the story does not name, but that both of them would remember for the rest of their existence. They came together in close combat. The sky above the field was the color of sand. The reeds at the edge of the ground stood perfectly still, the way reeds stand still before a storm when even the air seems to be holding its breath. Horus fought with everything he had. Set fought with everything he had, which was considerable, and which included the specific advantages of a being who had been fighting things in the dark since before Horus was born. In the fighting, Set took Horus's eye. Not a metaphor. Set reached into the struggle with the violence of a god who had been holding back for years and tore out the eye of his nephew and held it up in a hand that did not tremble and looked at it and felt, for the first time in a long time, something that might have been satisfaction. Horus went down. He did not stay down. This is the thing the story asks you to hold when everything else gets complicated. The loss of the eye did not end him. He carried it, the absence of it, the wound of it, and he kept going with what remained. He pressed his hand to the empty place where his eye had been and got back to his feet and continued. Because the alternative was to let Set keep what Set had taken. And that was the one thing he was not willing to do. Later, the eye would be restored. Thoth, the god of knowledge and writing, found the pieces of it and put it back together with the careful attention of someone who understood that what they were reassembling was more than an eye. The restored eye of Horus became one of the most powerful protective symbols in Egyptian civilization. You see it everywhere in Egyptian art, on coffins and amulets and the prows of boats and the walls of temples. An eye with a distinctive marking beneath it, painted in blue and gold. But the eye became that symbol not because it was perfect, because it had been broken and put back together, because it carried in its restored form the memory of the wound, because the thing that made it powerful as a symbol of protection was precisely the fact that it had been damaged and had survived the damage. Set was also marked by the conflict. The details are less prominent in the stories, less visually central, but they are there. Set paid for the fighting too, not in a way that diminished him permanently, but in a way that the story records because it is honest about what prolonged conflict costs both sides. They were both marked by this. The fighting continued. Set held the throne. Horus held something that was not a throne, but was, in some ways, harder to hold against him. Which was the claim? The argument that the throne belonged to a specific lineage, and that the lineage had not ended. That authority was not simply the result of having power. That power held without the right to hold it was a different thing from power held with the right, and that the difference mattered. Set argued back. He was managing Egypt. The crops had grown. The Nile had flooded. The borders were maintained. Whatever you thought about how he had come to the throne was functioning. The world had not ended. This was not nothing. This was a real argument. The conflict between them was not simply good against evil. It was legitimate against effective. Inheritance against occupation. The question of whether a king who does the job well has more right to the throne than the person who should have been king but grew up hidden in a marsh for most of his life. These questions did not have clean answers. That is why the fighting lasted as long as it did. Someone called a council. This is the other way wars end, when neither side can finish the other. When the fighting has gone on long enough and cost enough and produced enough of a stalemate that the parties involved decide that the question needs to be put before something larger than either combatant. A judgment. An appeal to authority that both sides nominally recognize, even if neither side is confident about the outcome. The Council of the Gods assembled to decide the question that Horus and Set had been fighting over for what felt like forever. It did not go smoothly. The gods argued. They took sides. They made their cases. And their cases contradicted each other. And the contradiction produced not resolution, but more argument. One faction held that Horus was the legitimate heir, and the matter was straightforward. Another held that Set was the stronger god, and Egypt needed strength at its center. A third position held that the question of legitimacy and the question of competence were not actually separable, and that the failure to separate them was producing an argument that could not be resolved because it was asking the wrong thing. A god named Banabjedet suggested splitting Egypt between them, giving Horus the north and Set the south, dividing the country along some geographic line, and declaring both claims partially satisfied. The goddess Neith sent word that the suggestion was insulting and that Horus should simply be given what was his. Thoth agreed with Neith. Ra, who was presiding over the proceedings, had sympathies that he was not entirely concealing, which created its own complications because the other gods were aware of his sympathies and adjusting their positions accordingly. At one point, a god left the assembly in frustration. The story records this with the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing something that happened at a difficult meeting, which is exactly what it was. What the council was doing, underneath all the argument, was working through something genuinely difficult. The question before them was not just about Horus and Set. It was about what kingship was, about whether the right to rule came from lineage, or from demonstrated capability, or from divine appointment, or from some combination of all three that no one had fully articulated, about whether the precedent set by their decision would bind them forever. These are not small questions. They are the questions that every civilization that has ever tried to organize itself has had to answer, and the answers have never been clean. Then a letter arrived from below. Osiris sent a message to the council from the land of the dead. The council had presumably been assuming that the dead stayed in the land of the dead and did not participate in the proceedings of the living. Osiris had a different understanding of the situation. The message was not angry. It was not desperate. It was the message of someone who has been watching a process unfold from a distance and has reached the point where silence is no longer the appropriate response. He reminded the council of what he had given to the world: the grain, the laws, the knowledge that had allowed civilization to organize itself into something more than survival. He noted that the plants that fed the gods themselves grew from the earth that he had made fertile. He observed, without elaborating, that the land of the dead was very large and that the land of the living was considerably smaller than the people in it sometimes remembered. He asked the council to consider whether the argument they were having was one they wanted to conduct in a world that still had grain, or in one that did not. This was not a threat. Osiris was not threatening the world. He was reminding the world of what it rested on, of the foundation that the visible argument was being conducted on top of the fact that the dead were not absent from the living world. They were underneath it. They had built it. The argument in the council shifted. The letter from Osiris did not end the argument immediately. Nothing ended it immediately. But it changed the quality of the argument. The way a light turned on in a room changes the quality of everything in the room. The things that had been said already looked different in the new light. Ra made a decision. He had been reluctant to make it, because making it required him to acknowledge that one side was right in a way that made the other side wrong. And Ra had been looking for a resolution that allowed everyone to leave feeling partially satisfied. He had been looking for that resolution for a long time and had not found it. And the letter from Osiris had made clear that the search for a resolution everyone could live with was consuming time that was better spent on the resolution that was actually correct. Horus was the legitimate heir. The throne belonged to him. Set had governed. Set had managed. Set had kept the floods coming, and the borders maintained, and the world operational. All of this was true, and none of it changed the fundamental fact that Set had taken what was not his and held it with the skill and patience of someone who had spent his whole life learning how to hold things in the dark. The verdict was delivered. Picture two men leaving a courthouse after a long trial. One of them won. He has organized his entire life around this case for years. Every meeting and document and night spent going over the details. He stands on the steps outside and does not feel what he expected to feel. He feels the absence of the fighting, the sudden removal of the forward pressure that has been his primary experience for so long. He feels lighter than he expected and also strangely unmoored, because the thing that has been organizing his days is over, and the days are going to need a new organizing principle. And he has not yet figured out what that principle is. He won. He knows he won. He is grateful. But standing on the steps in the afternoon light, he mostly feels how tired he is, how long this has been, how much of his life was spent on this one thing. Horus took the throne. He sat in the seat that his father had sat in the palace where Set had been sitting for all the years of the marshes and the fighting. He sat in it and felt its weight, which was the weight of everything his father had built and everything that came before that, and the entire chain of rulers going back to the beginning of the world. He also felt the absence. His father should have been there, not on the throne. Osiris would never sit on this throne again, and Horus had known this since the marshes. But there is knowing something, and there is being in the room where the thing you know is true, and feeling the specific shape of what is not there. The throne was his. The man whose throne it should have been was somewhere else. That was the victory, complete and incomplete at the same time, real and shadowed at the same time. Horus sent word to his father. The mechanics of this. How a living king communicates with the king of the dead are not something the story explains in practical terms. It was done the way the Egyptians did all the things that crossed the border between the living world and the dead one, through ritual, through the specific combination of words and actions and intention that the tradition had developed for exactly this kind of crossing. The message went down, and the response came back, and that was enough, because the story has always been more interested in what was said than in how the saying was accomplished. Osiris asked his son a question. He asked, what is the most noble thing a person can do? This is the question of a father who has been watching from below, who has seen the fighting and the marshes, and the years of being hidden and the council and the verdict and the throne, who knows everything his son has been through. Not because Osiris was all-knowing, but because the dead know the living in the particular way that the dead know the living, which is different from the way the living know each other, deeper in some ways, more patient, less filtered by the ordinary business of being alive, which takes up so much attention that there is not always room for seeing clearly what is in front of you. He asked the question that fathers ask when they want to know if their sons have understood the thing that matters most, the question that tests whether the son has understood a way of being, not just a set of facts. Horus answered, to honor your father and your mother. Osiris was satisfied. This is how the story records it. Satisfied, which is not the same as happy, and not the same as relieved, and not the same as any of the more dramatic emotional states that the moment might seem to call for. Satisfied is the word that belongs to someone who has been waiting to find out a specific thing and has now found it out and can rest in the knowledge of it. His son knew what mattered. That was enough, given everything, given the impossibility of the situation, given the specific and unchangeable fact that the distance between them was permanent. That was more than enough. It was the thing that settled the question of whether what Osiris had been was going to continue in the world, whether the values he had spent his life embodying were going to persist in the person who came after him, whether the throne would be held by someone who understood that honoring the people who gave you your life was not sentiment, but foundation. Osiris did not return. Here is where the story has to be allowed to stay where it is, without being moved into something more comfortable. He did not return. The work that Isis performed, the restoration that Anubis had accomplished, none of it opened the door back to the living world. It had opened a different door, and through that door, Osiris had passed into a different kind of existence, one that was real and meaningful, and in many ways more vast than the existence he had left. But that was not the living world. The throne was Horus's. The living world was Horus's. Osiris had somewhere else to be. A man stands in a cemetery in the late afternoon. His father has been dead for 6 months. The formal mourning is finished. The rituals are done. The family has moved back into ordinary life, with the particular adjustment that ordinary life requires after loss. The renegotiation of every habit and every expectation that had been organized around a presence that is no longer there. He stands at the grave, and he is not sure what he is doing exactly. He is talking. He is telling his father things he did not say when his father was alive. Not because he did not feel them then, but because the living speak differently to each other than the living speak to the dead, with more reservation and more guardedness and more assumption that there will be another chance to say the important things later. There is no later now. There is only this, the afternoon light and the stone and the words he is saying out loud to someone who cannot answer in any way he can hear. He talks for a long time. Then he stands in silence. Then he turns and walks back toward the road, back toward the car and the drive home and the dinner he will make, and the evening he will spend, and the morning he will wake up to. And life continues in the way that life continues, which is without asking whether you are ready. The absence walks with him. It does not diminish, but over the months, it changes its character. In the beginning, it was a wound. Now it is something more like a weight he carries, familiar and specific and entirely his own. Horus sat on the throne of Egypt and learned what it meant to be king of a world his father had built. He was good at it. He had been trained for it in the best possible school, which was the school of having nothing and watching his mother make something from it anyway. He had learned. In the marshes, and in the fighting, and in the long years of waiting. The things you cannot learn in a palace. The specific knowledge that comes from having been outside the system looking in, from having wanted something urgently and been unable to take it by force, from having had to be patient when patience was the hardest possible thing. He ruled. He ruled with his mother's intelligence and his father's quality of steadiness and his own particular thing, which was the quality that comes from people who have been through difficulty and come out the other side without having been made smaller by it. He held the throne with the grip of someone who understood what it cost. The eye of Horus, restored and whole, became the symbol of protection that Egyptian civilization carried with it across the next 3,000 years, painted on coffins and amulets and the prows of boats, an eye in blue and gold that looked out from every surface where people needed something watching over them. It became that symbol not because it was perfect, because it had been broken and healed and was whole in the way things are whole after they have been broken, which is different from the way things are whole before they have been broken. Differently strong, differently real. Osiris watched from below. He watched Horus rule and rule well. He watched Egypt find its new shape under his son's hands. He watched the seasons move and the Nile flood and the grain grow and the ordinary mornings arrive one after another. A long time ago now, in a world that felt very far from where he was. He was not haunting the living world or straining against the boundary between the dead and the living. He was where he was, and where he was had turned out to be something he had not anticipated and could not have anticipated, something that required its own kind of learning and its own kind of presence. He was the king of the dead. He was beginning to understand what that meant. It did not mean presiding over an absence. The dead were not absent. The dead were present in a way that the living, busy with the ordinary business of being alive, could not always see. The dead were the foundation, the thing underneath the visible world that made the visible world possible. Every grain of wheat that grew from Egyptian soil grew from earth that held the dead. Every flood that came and went and left, the black silt that fed the crops was moving through a land that was made of the accumulated presence of everyone who had lived and died in it. Osiris was the king of the foundation. He had not lost. He had changed locations. The child who had grown up in a palace and learned to maintain order and traveled to foreign lands to share what he knew had become something that the person he had been could not have imagined. Something larger. Something that the living world could not contain, because it existed in a different kind of space, the space that the living world rested on. He sat in his kingdom below and felt his son on the throne above him, the specific weight of Horus's presence in the world, and he understood what his own life had been for. The throne was above him. The foundation was around him. His son was ruling well. That was enough. Picture the Hall of Two Truths. You have seen it before. On the wall, in the room, at the beginning of this story. The scale with two plates hanging in balance. The feather on one plate, the heart on the other. You did not know yet what it meant. Now you do. This is the room that the dead came to. Every dead person in the Egyptian tradition, from the pharaoh in his pyramid to the farmer who had spent his life watching the Nile and died with nothing to his name but the calluses on his hands and the knowledge of which season required what from the soil. The hope that Egyptian funerary religion extended to all of them was the same. They arrived here eventually. The preparation varied, the wrapping and the words and the quality of the tomb. But in the world that the tradition imagined, the hall was the destination. At the far end of the hall, on a throne that was not made of gold or cedar or anything that the living world had a name for, Osiris sat. He did not look the way he had looked in the palace. In the years when the ordinary mornings were coming one after another, and the world was working, he looked the way the Egyptians painted him for 3,000 years, because the image they settled on was more accurate than any other image could have been. His skin was green, the green of new growth, the green of the first shoots coming through the black silt after the flood, pulled back, the green that appeared every year on the banks of the Nile when the water receded, and the land that had been under it revealed itself renewed, darker and richer and more alive than it had been before the flooding. His body was wrapped, not hidden, but held. The crook and the flail, the symbols of Egyptian kingship, crossed over his chest in hands that had earned the right to hold them in a way that no amount of inheritance or appointment could have produced. He held them the way you hold things you have paid for, with something real. He looked like someone who had been somewhere very dark and had found, in the darkness, something that the light had not been able to show him. The Egyptians called him Lord of the Westerners. The West was where the sun set. The West was where the dead went, into the place where the light diminished and the darkness waited. Lord of the Westerners meant Lord of everyone who had gone west. Lord of the country you entered when you finished being in the country you were born in. He was not frightening. This needs to be said because the images of death and its presiding deity have so consistently been used across so many cultures to inspire fear, to communicate that the power governing what happens after you die is a power that approaches you with appetite or judgment, or the cold indifference of something that processes you the way a mechanism processes its material. Osiris was not that. He was the green god on the Western throne, and the specific quality he brought to the Hall of Two Truths was the quality that you can only bring if you have been through what Osiris had been through, if you have been the person on the table rather than the person standing beside it, if you have experienced what the people standing before him were about to experience, and you know what it costs, and your judgment is the judgment of someone who knows. He knew what it felt like to be where they were going. He knew because he had been there first. The scale was real. The feather of Ma'at sat on one plate. The heart of the person who had arrived sat on the other. The heart held everything. The total of every decision made and every action taken and every moment of courage or cowardice or generosity or cruelty that had accumulated over the course of a life. If the heart was lighter than the feather, the person had lived in a way that accorded with Ma'at. They could continue. If the heart was heavier than the feather, a creature waited, part crocodile, par lion, part hippopotamus, assembled from the most dangerous animals. Egypt knew, and it consumed the heart, and the person was finished in the most complete sense of finished. Osiris presided over this. He did not presume the verdict before the scale settled. He did not accept arguments about what the scale should say if it said the wrong thing. He did not offer exemptions based on status or wealth or the quality of the funeral preparations. The farmer and the pharaoh stood before the same scale with the same feather and the same willingness of the scale to say whatever it actually said. This was the most honest thing about the Hall of Two Truths. The absolute refusal of the system to acknowledge any difference between the person who had owned 10,000 cattle and the person who had owned nothing. Both hearts weighed the same amount, or they did not. The scale did not care about what was outside the heart. Osiris had ruled Egypt, and Egypt had been good to him, and then Egypt had been taken from him, and the goodness of the world had turned out to be considerably more fragile than he had understood it to be. He had been inside a sealed box. He had been scattered across a country. He had been gathered and wrapped and restored to a form that was not identical to what had been gathered, because one piece was gone, and a replacement was not the same thing. He understood what it meant when things did not go the way they were supposed to. He understood this in a way that no god who had not experienced it could understand it. And that understanding was what made him the right presence at the center of the Hall of Two Truths. Because he had been through the thing that the people standing before him had been through, and he knew what it cost. And his judgment was the judgment of someone who knew The feather sat on its plate. The hearts of the dead came, one after another, in the procession that had been moving since the first person died in Egypt and would keep moving until the last one did. Farmers and pharaohs and merchants and priests and children and soldiers and women who had spent their whole lives watching the Nile, and men who had spent their whole lives building things that other men would take credit for. They all arrived. They all stood before the scale. He was the measure of what a life was worth. He knows what a life costs because he paid for his. Osiris watched the balance find its level, and he made his judgments, and the dead moved on into whatever came next, or into the mouth of the waiting creature, where those who had not passed were finished in the most permanent way available. Above him, the living world continued. The Nile flooded and receded. The grain grew. The ordinary mornings came one after another, in the way ordinary mornings always had. Horus on his throne, Egypt in its seasons, the chain of kings that would stretch forward from Horus through all the centuries that the civilization had left in it, each one living as Horus and dying as Osiris. The double pattern that the story of the green god had made possible. Below him, the dead arrived. The farmer who had stood at the edge of the Nile and watched the water, not knowing if the flood would come, knowing only that something was supposed to keep the promise. The farmer arrived, the way everyone arrived, and he stood before the scale, and his heart was weighed against the feather. Osiris looked at him. He looked at this man who had spent his life watching the river the way Osiris had spent his life trying to make the river worth watching. He looked at the heart on the scale. He looked at the feather. He made his judgment. The man moved on. Another heart arrived. The scale did not rest. In the tombs of Egypt, the dead have names. This sounds obvious. Of course they have names, but spend a moment with what it means in practice, what it costs to put a name in stone, what it required of the people left behind. Stone takes time. Stone takes skill. Stone takes money that most of the people who ever lived in Egypt did not have in quantities that allowed for anything beyond survival. And yet, across the whole of Egyptian history, across 3,000 years of civilization, people found ways to put names in stone. Farmers, potters, women who carried water, and men who made sandals, and children who did not live long enough to have an occupation worth recording. They found ways. They saved. They traded. They called in obligations. They did whatever they had to do, because somewhere underneath the practical calculation was a belief so deep it did not need to be articulated. If the name was there, the person was not entirely gone. If the name was gone, the person was. This belief did not come from nowhere. It came from Osiris, or more precisely, from what had happened to Osiris and what had prevented the worst version of that outcome. Set had scattered the pieces. The pieces could have stayed scattered. The identity of Osiris. The specific divine personality that had made Egypt work and had made order feel possible could have dissolved into the land the way things dissolve when there is nothing and no one to hold them together. What held them together was being remembered. Isis remembered. She walked the length of a country with the memory of who he was driving every step. Nephthys remembered. Anubis built structures around the memory to keep it from dissolving before it could be restored. The people of Abydos remembered. Year after year, until the remembering became older than anyone living and younger than the story itself. Memory was the thing that Set had not been able to scatter. Over many generations, the Egyptians extended this logic outward from the divine to the human. If it was true for Osiris, if the god who had been most completely shattered had been held together by the refusal of the people who loved him to stop remembering him, then perhaps the same principle applied to ordinary people who died ordinary deaths and were placed in ordinary tombs with their names cut into the available stone. Perhaps the name in the stone was not just sentiment. Perhaps it was function. In funerary traditions that developed over centuries, the dead person was often referred to as Osiris, their specific name attached to his. The texts read the Osiris Noctamun, the Osiris Meritaten, the Osiris, whoever this person was. The dead person was being located within the story of Osiris, placed inside the pattern he had established, identified with the trajectory he had traced, the death, the gathering, the restoration, the whole, the judgment, the continuation. The dead person was doing what Osiris had done. They were on the same road. They were following the same map. What Isis had been doing when she walked through Egypt looking for pieces was walking the road first. What Anubis had been doing in the Delta Marsh was building the path so that others could follow it. What the Hall of Two Truths was doing was providing the destination that the path led to. The whole structure existed not just for Osiris, but because of Osiris. Because the pattern he had traced through death and restoration and transformation had made it possible for others to trace the same pattern after him. Think about what this gave to ordinary people. An old woman is preparing what she hopes will be her final instructions to her family. She has lived a long life, and she is not afraid of dying. Not exactly. But she is afraid of the specific thing that the tradition had always identified as the real fear beneath the fear of death. She is afraid of becoming nothing, of the specific erasure of the self that the loss of name and memory and physical form represents. She has worked hard. She has raised children and managed a household, and made decisions that turned out right and decisions that turned out wrong, and learned from both, and kept going. She has been someone. She is afraid of no longer being someone. She cannot afford a large tomb. She cannot afford an elaborate funeral. What she can afford is a small stone marker with her name on it, placed where the priests will see it when they make their rounds and speak the words that keep the dead connected to the living. That stone marker, with her name on it, connects her to something much larger than the marker itself. It connects her to Osiris, not because she was divine or important or particularly remarkable by any historical measure, because she died, the way Osiris died, and because she prepared for that death, the way the tradition that Osiris had made possible prescribed, and because her name was on stone, the way names needed to be. There was a hall, there was a scale, there was a green god on a throne who knew from the inside what it cost to be where she was going. She was not going into nothing. The papyrus scrolls that traveled with the dead into their tombs were not one fixed book handed down from the beginning of time. They were a tradition, a collection of prayers and instructions and images that had accumulated over centuries, added to and revised and adapted by different priests in different periods. What we call today the Book of the Dead is the name scholars gave to this material when they began cataloguing it in the 19th century of the Common Era. The Egyptians themselves called it something closer to the words for going out by day. What the scrolls were, in practical terms, was a preparation, a set of tools for the journey, instructions for what to say at particular moments, how to address particular guardians, what names to invoke when particular obstacles presented themselves. The dead person was expected to speak in their own defense, to know the right words at the right time, to move through the world of the dead, not as a passive object being processed, but as an active traveler navigating a difficult terrain. This was deliberate. The dead person in the Egyptian tradition was not a victim of death. They were a traveler. The destination was real, within that imagination, and reachable, and the journey, though difficult, had been traveled before. Osiris had traveled it first. Every instruction in every papyrus scroll placed in every tomb was, in some sense, knowledge drawn from the pattern Osiris had established. He had been through the darkness. He had been in the place where the instructions were needed. He had emerged from that place as the person who could sit at its center and preside over the emergence of others. He was the map and the map maker and the country the map described. A priest in a city reads aloud from a papyrus scroll. He stands beside a body that has been wrapped and prepared and is ready to be placed in its tomb. He reads with the practiced steadiness of someone who has said these words many times and understands that the steadiness is itself part of the function. He reads the name of the dead person alongside the name of Osiris. Outside, Egypt moves through its mourning. The market is opening. Children are running. The Nile is doing what the Nile does. Inside, the priest is reading the dead person into the company of the green god, and in the hall, below the world, the scale is waiting. The feather is balanced on its plate, and the king of the foundation is listening for the name that is coming. Egypt fell. This is not a detail the story usually includes, but it is the most important context for understanding why the story of Osiris matters beyond the borders of the civilization that created it. Egypt fell the way all civilizations fall, slowly and then all at once, through a combination of internal pressures and external forces, and the accumulated weight of a very long existence, finally reaching a point where the structures that had maintained it could no longer do what they had been built to do. The Persians came, then Alexander, then the generals who divided what Alexander had built, then Rome. Each successive power brought its own framework for understanding the world, its own theology, its own answer to the questions that Egypt had spent 3,000 years developing answers to. The temples were closed. The last known hieroglyphic inscription was carved at Philae in 394 of the Common Era. Then silence. The language that had carried the story of Osiris through 3 millennia of telling became a language that no one alive could read. The story should have ended there. It did not. Before Egypt fell, the Greeks came to it, not as conquerors at first, but as students. The civilization that the Greeks recognized as the oldest and most sophisticated in the world they had access to. The country whose monuments made everything Greece had built look recent and provisional. They came to learn, and they learned. The way ambitious people learn from traditions older than their own, by absorbing what they could and translating it into the framework of their own understanding and taking it home. They took Osiris home. A Greek writer named Plutarch, living in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, wrote about Isis and Osiris at length and with genuine seriousness. He was not recycling exotic material for entertainment. He was a philosopher and a priest of Apollo who approached the Egyptian tradition with the respect due to something he understood to be addressing real questions. He gathered the threads of the story, the murder and the search and the restoration and the judgment and the green god on the Western throne, and he wove them into a version that people who had never stood in a temple in Abydos could follow and feel the weight of. The Romans absorbed what the Greeks had absorbed. The tradition of Isis spread through the Roman Empire into places that had never had contact with Egypt, into cities in what is now France and Germany and Britain, into the lives of people who had no relationship to the Nile or the Delta or the specific agricultural rhythms that the flood and the planting and the harvest had built into the Egyptian understanding of death and restoration. They went anyway. They went to the temples that were built in Roman cities, far from Egypt. They brought offerings. They were seeking something that the story of Osiris had always been the container for, which was the specific hope that the worst thing that could happen to a person was not the end of the story. Set thought he had solved the problem of Osiris by making the problem large enough, by distributing it across a country and a sea and a foreign palace and a cedar pillar, and finally across the land again in 14 pieces, too scattered and too far apart to be gathered by anyone with less than everything. He was wrong about what Isis had, and he was wrong about something larger than that. He was wrong about what stories were. He thought a story lived in a body, the way a king lived in a palace, and that if you destroyed the body completely enough, the story would have nowhere to live and would dissolve. He did not understand that stories live in people, in the mouths and the memories of the people who tell them, and the people who hear them and carry them forward into the next telling. He scattered the pieces of Osiris across Egypt. Egypt scattered the story of Osiris across the world. The temples closed. The language died. The civilization that had built the pyramids and the great monuments of the Nile Valley became a thing that later civilizations picked through for material and meaning. The story kept moving. It moved through Plutarch's Greek and through the Latin that Rome made the language of scholarship across half the world. It moved into the medieval tradition of learning, where scholars copied ancient texts without always understanding what they were copying. It moved into the centuries when Europeans began excavating Egypt, and the world found out that the story was older and more complex and more sophisticated than any single retelling had suggested. It moved into museums and into the recurring human appetite for stories about death and what comes after it, and whether what comes after it is navigable. It is here now. Set is still on his boat in the darkness, fighting the serpent that wants to end the world. This is the thing about Set that the story of his crime tends to obscure. He is still doing his job. He is still in the dark, every night, doing the most necessary and least acknowledged thing in the universe. The serpent is still there. The sun still needs to get through. Set is complicated in the way that real things are complicated. He did the worst thing the story contains. He is also doing, right now, the thing that makes the world possible. The things that hurt us and the things that sustain us are sometimes the same forces, operating in different directions. The desert that threatens to swallow everything is also the desert that kept the enemies away. The chaos that killed the king is also the chaos that holds the serpent back. What Set could not kill was the meaning. He could kill the body. He did. He could scatter the pieces. He did. He could take the throne and hold it with all the skill and patience and cold intelligence that his nature had produced over a lifetime of doing necessary work in the dark. He did all of that. He could not kill the hope that what was broken could be gathered, that what was scattered could be brought together, that the people who loved you would not let you dissolve into the land without a fight, without a name on stone, without the words spoken over your wrapped body that put you into the company of the god who had been where you were going and had found a way through. He could not kill Isis. Isis is still walking. She has been walking since the morning she looked at Set across a room and understood what had happened and turned away and began. She walked through Egypt with the memory of who Osiris was driving every step, and she found him in 14 places. And she brought him home, and she sat beside him with her sister in the dark and made enough noise about the loss that the pieces began to cohere again. Every time a person refuses to let grief make them stop, every time someone who has lost the thing most important to them gets up anyway and begins again. Not because they feel like it. Not because the future is clear. Not because they have a plan that makes the next step logical. Gets up because standing still would mean accepting that what was taken cannot be found. Every time that happens, Isis is walking. She walked for love. She walked for justice. She walked because Osiris was Osiris, and the world without him in it had a wrongness at its center that she was not willing to simply absorb and call it the nature of things. Osiris is still on his throne. The scale is still in the hall. The hearts of the dead are still arriving, one after another, in the procession that has no beginning and no end, carrying everything a person was and placing it on the plate and waiting for the feather to say what the feather says. He knows what the people coming to him are carrying. He knows because he carried it. He was inside the sealed box. He was scattered across the land. He was gathered by hands that refused to stop, and wrapped by hands that knew what wrapping meant, and spoken over by a voice that knew the words that only she knew. He came through. Set took a king from Egypt, and Egypt turned the king into a road. Every person who died in Egypt after Osiris walked that road. Every person who was wrapped in white linen and had their name placed alongside his name on stone, and was sent into the dark with words that told them what to say at each door. Every person who was feared for by people who loved them and mourned by women in white who sat beside them and refused to let them disappear into silence. They all walked the road that Osiris made. He made it by being the first to go. He did not choose to be first. He did not volunteer for the darkness, or for the scattering, or for the gathering that came after, or for the hall and the scale and the judgment. He was put there by his brother, who thought he was putting him nowhere, who thought that scattered was the same as gone. Scattered was not the same as gone. Osiris went into the dark and Isis followed him, and the dark turned out to be a place with a floor and a throne and a scale, and a green god who had been through what you were going through and knew, from the specific authority of personal experience, that the other side of it was real. The scale is waiting. We are back in the room. The same oil lamps, the same smell of natron and cedar resin, the same pair of hands moving over the wrapped figure on the table, checking the work, making sure that what has been done correctly. Because correctness here is not a bureaucratic standard but an act of care for someone who cannot advocate for themselves anymore. The hands reach for the mask. You know this mask now. You know where the green comes from. You know what the straight beard means and why the eyes are painted to look at something beyond the room. You know that the face being lifted and carried toward the face of the dead person is not decoration. It is placement, an act of putting the person who has just died into a story that was already in motion long before they were born and will still be in motion long after everyone in this room has also made the journey. They are currently preparing this person to make. The hands lower the mask. For one moment, two faces exist in the same space. The face of a man who was alive last week, who ate meals and made decisions and loved certain people and did the ordinary work of being a human being in a world that required constant navigation. And the face of a god who was murdered by his brother and scattered across a country and gathered piece by a woman who refused to accept that scattered was the end. The mask settles. Now there is only one face, green and still and looking at something none of the living people in the room can see. On the wall behind the table, in the lamplight that makes everything flicker at the edges, the painted scale hangs between its painted plates, the heart on one side, the feather on the other. You have been looking at this image since the beginning of this story. Now you understand it. The feather is Mart, the condition that holds the world together. The heart is everything this person was, the sum of their choices and their fears and their generosities and their failures, and the specific texture of the life they built from the materials available to them. Somewhere below the world, the scale that this painting depicts is real within the world, this tradition built, and at its center, the green god sits on his throne with the crook and the flail crossed over his chest, waiting for the next one. He has been waiting since the first Egyptian died and needed somewhere to go. He knows what it costs to arrive at that hall. He knows because he arrived there first. Not by choice, not by any path he would have chosen, but through a sealed box and a river and a foreign shore and the hands of a woman who would not stop looking for him and the hands of a god who rebuilt what had been broken and the long patience of a son who grew up without a father and fought to honor what that father had been. He came through all of that. The person on this table is about to go where he went. The path has been walked. Someone was there before them. And the God who sits at the end of that path is not a stranger to what they are carrying, because he carried it too. And he knows, from the inside, that the other side of it exists. The hands of the priest press lightly on the mask, checking that it is properly seated. Then he stands back. The work is done. He turns and walks toward the door, and his footsteps are quiet on the floor, and the lamps flutter slightly in the air. He moves through, and then he is gone, and the door is closed, and the room is still. The man in the linen is ready.